All right, this is Traderfirstyear, and this is what I will call Letters to Congress. It's going to be in that portion of the channel in the Discord if you go in. This is a letter for congressional reps for tomorrow's testimony, which is called the Humphrey Hawkins. It's a semi-annual testimony that the Federal Reserve Chairman goes in and answers questions from House of Representatives and the House's Financial Services Committee over the course of one day, and then he goes into the Senate Banking Committee and answers additional questions. So it's congressional oversight of the Federal Reserve. So I posed a lot of questions in an email to a bunch of representatives, including my own, and this is what I have to say. I am an older millennial that lived in your district and wanted to discuss some issues I would like you to raise with Chairman Powell at the upcoming Humphrey Hawkins testimony. There are three topics I would like raised, which I believe are of great national importance over the upcoming decade, 2020 to 2030. The first deals chiefly with the specific language in the Humphrey Hawkins legislation tied to the first part of the Federal Reserve's dual mandate for maximum employment, which is usually calculated in economic models via the NAIRU Concept, which is a natural rate of unemployment. The second deals with the dire need for the fiscal deficit spending on publicly led federal and state and local government investment in human capital, infrastructure, and research and development. These are targeted investments which would help expand capacity and grow the U.S. economy. These are in dire need in the 21st century for the U.S. to maintain competitiveness, but also to increase productivity so we can achieve a higher level of potential growth, which is currently constrained by demographics like the aging of the U.S. population, low fertility rates, slow labor force growth, and relatively low productivity growth. The final topic deals with the global economy and the re-emergence of China as a potential superpower. I would like to see how the Federal Reserve views China's capital account liberalization and the potential for a new multipolar economic system which deviates from the previous Bretton Woods US dollar reserve currency world. How does the chairman view China's shifting economy from a high savings to one more reliant on domestic consumption? This shift will have dramatic effects on US millennials. How will changes in China's level of savings and consumption negatively affect the future of the US economy and US millennial prosperity, or our standard of living? In 1967, Milton Friedman gave a speech at a presidential address to the American Economic Association, in which he detailed a concept known as the natural rate of unemployment. The concept is referred to as NAIRU, which is the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Over the past 50 years, NAIRU has had a very negative effect on what level employment the Federal Reserve regards as full employment before engaging in rate hikes to slow the economy and restrain potential inflationary impulse and pressures. There are many economists who view this concept as pernicious due to the limited supporting data backing its existence. Should this concept continue to be used as policy prescriptions for tightening monetary policy? I'm an older millennial, but this policy is of great concern to me given its ability to force the Federal Reserve to tighten policy or slow economic growth too soon. This has had a very undesirable effect on long-term potential growth rates, economic dynamism, and expanding the size of the U.S. middle class. All factors which, in my humble opinion, would be contributors to a prosperous future for U.S. millennials and younger generations. I would request you look into this concept attached to the first part of the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, and if possible, suggest a hearing which seeks to gather all professional economists and policy setters to figure out if this concept is still valid or a relic of past inflationary circumstances. In a previous life, I was a deficit hawk, but given COVID-19's impact on the broader U.S. economy, it is obvious we need a very large deficit spending package or packages. We need to restore aggregate demand and raise domestic consumption levels. However, the fiscal deficit cannot be and should not be solely used or focused on domestic consumption. We have to focus a large portion on spending on targeted public investments. The most critical and important is public-led investment in human capital. The U.S. is in dire need of a labor force upgrade, which can only be done at the federal, state, and local levels, with massive investment in the U.S. labor supply. This will allow us to be more competitive in the 21st century as China pursues its goal of moving up the value chain. We have close to 120 million U.S. workers needing skills upgrades. These are long-term investments which are not likely to pay off in the immediate 2 or 3 years, but more likely to pay off and pay huge dividends in the 2030s and the 2040s. Along with investment in human capital, we need deficit spending to encapsulate additional spending on U.S. infrastructure and research and development. Given the low fertility rates, anemic population growth, stagnant labor force growth, aging of the U.S. population, and the slowdown in immigration, we need to make public investment a priority if we are to raise productivity. It seems we are constrained from a supply side standpoint, which leaves only investment to raise future productivity in the near and long term. China's capital account liberalization and the U.S. international investment position are the economically most undiscussed parts of the global economy in the 21st century. In my humble opinion, understanding the changing behavior of China's savings and investment domestically, as well as its growing international investment position, is a key topic of further understanding. I'm very concerned with the potential for changing capital flows, which have financed very large U.S. twin deficits for more than 4 decades, but may seek to diversify away from U.S. dollar-denominated assets and hold a higher proportion of yuan-denominated assets. A simple solution to me is an immediate request to look into a second pairing of the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve. This was previously done in an accord from 1941 to 1953. The benefits from this relationship on the U.S. international investment position are immediately felt through the Federal Reserve's remittance to the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. fiscal deficit, due to mandatory spending programs like Social Security and Medicare, is going to intensify after 2025, once all boomers turn 65. One way to effectively avoid massive outflow on interest payments to foreigners holding U.S. Treasury debt is to allow a much closer decade of cooperation between the U.S. Federal Reserve and Treasury. Allowing the U.S. Federal Reserve to warehouse a larger U.S. Treasury position would help stem this immediate deterioration in the U.S. international investment position. The politics around accomplishing this in the short term would seem undesirable, but the long-term benefits in an accord are undeniably in favor of millennial economic prosperity. Following the COVID-19 U.S. recession of 2020, it is imperative we utilize the right policy prescriptions and out-of-the-box ideas to restore sustainable economic growth and U.S. vitality. This will include the Federal Reserve pursuing policies which allow the U.S. economy to run hot, which means a prolonged period of growth above potential. They will need the support of Congress changing or altering the legislation tied to the unemployment portion of the Humphrey Hawkins legislation. I would prefer a specific language of full employment at or around 2.5% to 3% before the Federal Reserve considers future rate hikes. I would also encourage Congress to tolerate a higher level of inflation as part of the price stability portion of the language. This could be between 2.5% to 3.5%. It is extremely important the Federal Reserve ignore previous inflation institutional dogma in the 21st century. China's re-emergence on the global scene could pose substantial capital flow risk, which may harm the U.S.'s ability to rely on a potentially shrinking global savings surplus to fund very large twin deficits in the future. A workaround is allowing the warehousing of U.S. Treasury holdings onto the Federal Reserve's balance sheet in a new 21st century Treasury Federal Reserve Accord. The goal would be to stem any deterioration in the U.S. international investment position due to capital outflows associated with interest payments on the U.S. debt. I am just a very concerned older millennial, and I think much less about today and much more about the global economic outlook and world economy in 2025. Thanks for listening.